Keir Starmer, Keir, why do you keep inviting millions of refugees in the country when there's 1.3 million people waiting for housing?
I'll always stand by you. But if you think Labour's going to win, start saving now. Mark my words, a Labour government will bleed you dry with taxes, and it's in their very DNA to come after your earnings, your car, your pension. Thank you. Sorry, folks. Labour will tax everything that moves. The contrast at this election couldn't be clearer. Karma's lot will reverse. All the positive changes I've brought about, and that's going to hit everyone hard in their wallets. It would slap an extra £2,000 in taxes on every single person. Stick with our plan and illegal migrants will be on those planes back where they came from. With Labour, they will be roaming free on our streets. What are you going to do with the flood of people who come here illegally? What's your plan for dealing with them? Tell us, what's the big idea? I've got a solid plan to deal with it, because I'm going to put them on planes and send them packing. So, what's your solution? I can lay out my clear plan for everyone in just 5 weeks. Either K-Star or I will be Prime Minister. I'll cut your taxes, safeguard your pension, and drastically reduce immigration. I have a clear vision for a more secure future for you and your family. We've now got 2-tier healthcare, 2-tier policing, and a 2-tier justice system. That's the grim reality we're facing. It's utterly appalling when attackers at Manchester Airport walk free, facing no charges whatsoever, while people who write offensive drivel on Facebook end up in prison. Something is fundamentally wrong. Breaking news. King Charles just did something no British monarch has dared to do in over 300 years. He strode into a live parliamentary session, looked directly at Karma, and delivered a verbal lashing so devastating that the Prime Minister was rendered speechless, utterly immobile, barely able to breathe. 3 cabinet ministers immediately stormed out in protest. The pound crashed within minutes. And what Charles revealed next has ignited the biggest constitutional crisis Britain has witnessed since the abdication crisis of 1936. This isn't some flimsy rumor. This isn't idle speculation. This all unfolded today, and by the time you finish watching this video, you'll fully grasp why Keir Starmer's government teeters on the brink of collapse. But first, you need to know precisely what the King said that left 650 MPs sitting in utter, gobsmacked silence. It began like any other ordinary Wednesday afternoon in Westminster at precisely 2:17 p.m. Karma, smugly confident, stood at the dispatch box, grandstanding and delivering a speech about his much-vaunted new housing reform bill. Utterly standard procedure. Routine. Parliamentary business as usual. Ministers were nodding along robotically, barely listening. Backbench MPs were more engrossed in scrolling through their phones. The press gallery was practically deserted, half empty, because nobody anticipated anything remotely newsworthy. It was shaping up to be the most mind-numbingly boring afternoon of the entire political calendar. But then, without warning, the ancient oak doors of the House of Commons swung open with a resounding thud. And everything irrevocably changed in an instant. The Sergeant-at-Arms, resplendent in his ceremonial garb, entered the chamber carrying Black Rod, the ornate ceremonial staff that officially summons Parliament to the House of Lords. Every single MP in that room instantly recognized the chilling significance of what it meant. The monarch himself was summoning them. But Parliament was already actively in session. The King simply does not, under any circumstances, interrupt live proceedings. It's unheard of. It simply doesn't happen. There's absolutely no precedent for it. No established protocol, no recognized procedure. MPs exchanged bewildered glances, looking at each other in complete confusion and disbelief. Some initially thought it was some kind of bizarre drill. Others desperately assumed there must be some monumental mistake. But the Sergeant-at-Arms solemnly kept walking, his face an absolute mask of deadly seriousness. And the chamber was plunged into an eerie, almost tomb-like silence. Starmer, mid-sentence, abruptly ground to a halt, his carefully constructed rhetoric abandoned. His hand remained suspended in the air, frozen in a grandiloquent gesture that suddenly seemed utterly meaningless. His face visibly went pale, the color draining away. Witnesses in the press gallery later recounted that you could actually see the color visibly drain from his cheeks in real time. He shot a desperate, questioning glance at the speaker. The speaker, equally dumbfounded, helplessly looked back at him. Neither of them had the faintest clue what to do. This unprecedented situation wasn't covered in any rulebook. This simply wasn't supposed to be possible under any circumstances. And yet, incredibly, it was happening right before their very eyes. Broadcast live to millions of bewildered viewers across the nation who had absolutely no idea. They were about to witness a pivotal moment in history. Within a mere 90 seconds, the entire House of Commons was unceremoniously on its feet, hastily filing out of the chamber in what could only accurately be described as organized chaos. MPs were whispering frantically to each other, exchanging worried glances. Some were already frantically texting journalists, desperately seeking answers. Others were frantically calling their offices, desperately trying to find out what the hell was actually happening, but nobody had any concrete answers. The only tangible thing anyone knew for certain was that King Charles had just shattered over 300 years of sacrosanct constitutional convention, and he certainly wouldn't have done it without an extraordinary and compelling reason. The atmosphere and scene inside the House of Lords was utterly unlike anything seasoned witnesses had ever previously described. King Charles stood imposingly at the foot of the throne, but something was immediately, jarringly wrong. He wasn't wearing his customary ceremonial robes. There was no glittering crown, no dazzling royal regalia, no gleaming golden chains of office. He stood there, instead in a simple, understated dark suit, looking far more like a somber businessman than the reigning monarch. And his weary face told a powerful story that mere words couldn't possibly capture. He looked utterly exhausted, emotionally drained. He also looked undeniably angry, simmering with barely suppressed fury. But more than anything else, he looked resolute, like a man who had finally made an irreversible decision that could never, ever be undone. The Lord Speaker, visibly flustered, approached the microphone to tentatively begin the rigid, formal protocols. There are meticulously specific words that absolutely must be spoken, specific procedures that absolutely must be religiously followed. Centuries of unbroken tradition rigidly dictate exactly how these solemn moments are supposed to traditionally unfold. But before the Lord Speaker could even utter a single mandatory syllable, Charles slowly raised his hand in a gesture that brooked no argument. The gesture was small, subtle, but utterly absolute in its authority. Everyone immediately stopped dead. The entire packed chamber held its collective breath in anticipation. And then the king spoke, uttering just 6 simple words that completely shattered every single rule in the constitutional playbook. "That won't be necessary," he said quietly, his voice deceptively calm. His voice, though quiet, carried a steely edge of suppressed emotion that made even the most senior, hardened politicians physically uncomfortable and deeply uneasy. "I have not come here today for empty ceremony. I have come here because prolonged silence is no longer a viable option." The carefully maintained decorum of the chamber immediately erupted in chaos. Conservative MPs started heckling and shouting in outrage. Labour backbenchers exchanged glances of abject horror and disbelief. Lindsay Hy, the increasingly frantic Speaker of the House of Commons, banged his gavel with such ferocious force that witnesses genuinely thought he might actually break it in half, but absolutely nobody was listening to him. Nobody could properly process what they were witnessing with their own eyes. The King of England, the sovereign himself, was about to directly, publicly address and condemn the government's recent conduct, and there was absolutely nothing anyone present could possibly do to effectively stop him. Charles patiently waited for the cacophony of noise to gradually die down. He didn't appear even slightly rushed or flustered. He didn't appear even remotely nervous or apprehensive. If anything, witnesses later recounted that he appeared far more composed, more in control, than anyone else in the entire room. When the shouting and jeering finally faded into a tense, oppressive silence, he calmly continued speaking, and every carefully chosen word landed like a devastating hammer blow, resonating with chilling force. I have meticulously watched this current government, he began, his piercing eyes deliberately scanning the Labour benches. I have watched my government systematically drive this once great nation toward a treacherous precipice. I have dutifully stayed silent as strict constitutional protocol strictly demands of me. I've mechanically signed legislation I personally found deeply troubling and morally questionable. I've even smiled politely at policies I personally found utterly destructive to the fabric of our society. Because that is precisely what constitutional monarchs are traditionally expected to do. We conventionally remain rigidly above the grubby fray of politics. We naively trust that elected officials will genuinely serve the true people's best interests. We sincerely believe that democracy, however fundamentally imperfect it may be, will eventually, inevitably correct its own inherent mistakes. But there inevitably comes a definitive moment, Charles continued, his normally measured voice now noticeably growing harder and more resolute with each passing word. When prolonged silence effectively becomes complicity, when passively standing aside effectively becomes actively standing with, when blindly trusting the established system ultimately means consciously betraying the very people that system is supposedly designed to protect and serve. That moment arrived irrevocably yesterday, and I will personally not be complicit in what inevitably comes next. The entire chamber was now utterly frozen in stunned silence. Nobody visibly moved a muscle. Nobody even dared to whisper. Even the seasoned journalists in the press gallery had completely stopped frantically typing, their fingers frozen mid-air, hovering helplessly over their keyboards as they desperately tried to properly comprehend the sheer enormity of what they were all witnessing. A serving British monarch was publicly and unequivocally condemning a sitting government's policies and conduct. It hadn't occurred in Britain since the turbulent 17th century. It simply wasn't supposed to be possible in modern, supposedly stable Britain. And yet here it was, unfolding in real time, broadcast, lived to every corner of the bewildered world. Starr, his face ashen, stood stock-still amongst the frozen crowd of stunned MPs, and eyewitness sources later recounted that he looked precisely like a condemned man passively watching his own slow, inexorable execution. His increasingly agitated aides were desperately trying to grab his attention, frantically gesturing for him to urgently do something, say something, anything at all, to meaningfully respond in some way to the unprecedented situation. But the Prime Minister remained utterly motionless, frozen to the spot. One visibly shocked Labour MP who happened to be standing near him later described his almost catatonic expression as being like someone who had just been coldly informed that their entire life had, in fact, been a complete and utter lie. But Charles clearly wasn't finished speaking yet. Not even remotely close. Because what he proceeded to say next didn't just politely criticize the government's questionable performance. It directly accused them of engaging in something far more serious and sinister. Something so grave that it could potentially trigger not just an immediate political crisis of unprecedented scale, but also full-blown criminal investigations involving the police. Something so utterly damning that it made 3 senior cabinet ministers physically stand up in open revolt and brazenly walk out of the hallowed chamber in full view of rolling cameras, abandoning their posts. What exactly did King Charles audaciously accuse Starmer of actively doing? And why did 3 senior cabinet ministers immediately flee the moment he uttered those damning words? The 3 cabinet ministers who so dramatically walked out didn't simply leave quietly and discreetly. They actually openly fled, panicked. Transport Secretary Louise Hay was the very first to make her dramatic move. She visibly stood up so abruptly and hastily that she clumsily knocked her scattered papers sprawling to the floor in disarray. She pointedly didn't bother to pick them up. She pointedly didn't even bother to look back. She simply walked straight towards the nearest exit with her head bowed low in obvious shame, pointedly refusing to make any eye contact with anyone. Within mere seconds, Home Secretary. Yvette Cooper swiftly followed suit, also abandoning her post. Then Education. Secretary Bridget Phillips' son, 3 of the most senior and influential figures in Star's own flailing government, ignominiously gone in less than 2 tumultuous minutes. The visual optics were utterly catastrophic for the government. The implicit message was crystal clear for everyone to see. Whatever damaging information Charles was clearly about to divulge next, they wanted absolutely no part of it whatsoever, and were desperate to distance themselves as much as possible. Cameras mercilessly captured every embarrassing moment in excruciating detail. Sky News swiftly cut to a revealing split screen, grimly showing the fleeing ministers leaving in disgrace while Charles stoically continued speaking, his voice unwavering. BBC. Parliament's live feed relentlessly showed horrified Labour MPs in the chamber turning in their seats to watch their own colleagues publicly abandon them to their inevitable fate. Social media went instantly ballistic, exploding before the king had even finished delivering his explosive sentence. The mocking #CabinetWalkout instantly started trending globally within a mere 90 seconds, rapidly gathering pace. Political commentators, who had collectively spent decades diligently covering the often turbulent happenings of Westminster, universally said that they had simply never seen anything even remotely like it in their entire careers. Ministers simply don't publicly walk out on the monarch in such a blatant show of disloyalty. It's simply unheard of. It simply doesn't happen. But these clearly terrified ministers knew something deeply disturbing. They clearly knew what damaging revelations were coming. And they desperately wanted to be as far away as humanly possible when the inevitable fallout finally landed. Charles calmly watched them leave, his expression unreadable. He didn't pointedly comment on their dramatic departure. He didn't even pause for breath. If anything, their brazen departure seemed to only strengthen his inner resolve to continue undeterred. He nonchalantly reached into his jacket pocket and carefully pulled out a single, folded sheet of worn paper. The crucial document was visibly worn at the delicate edges, clearly having been handled and read countless times previously. He held it aloft deliberately, so that the entire hushed chamber could clearly see it. And when he spoke again, his resonant voice carried such palpable weight and authority that it made even the most seasoned politicians visibly look away in abject shame. I have personally received, he began slowly and deliberately, over 14,000 handwritten letters in the past month alone, expressing their concerns. He paused for effect. 14,000 ordinary British citizens who felt they had absolutely nowhere else left to turn for help. These are not shadowy political activists. These are not opposition operatives actively trying to deliberately destabilize the government. These are simply ordinary, decent people. He paused again. Grandmothers from Cornwall, hard-working factory workers from Birmingham, dedicated teachers from Edinburgh, compassionate nurses from Cardiff. He paused once more. They all took the time to write to me personally because they genuinely believe, perhaps naively, that their king might still actually care deeply about their mounting suffering when their own elected government clearly does not. The Labour benches remained rooted in stunned silence. Some terrified MPs were staring fixedly at the floor in shame. Others had buried their heads in their trembling hands, as if trying to block out what was happening. One visibly shaken backbencher was even visibly crying. The heavy weight of those 14,000 individual letters hung oppressively over that chamber like a damning verdict delivered by the people. 14,000 ordinary people who had completely lost all remaining faith in the democratic process, so completely that they were now actively writing to the monarchy, begging for help and intervention. That staggering number alone was utterly damning. But Charles was now about to make it intensely personal, in a direct way that would inevitably haunt karma for the remainder of his entire political life. He carefully unfolded the well-worn paper in his steady hand. This particular letter, he said gravely, is touchingly from a frail 94-year-old man named Albert Hughes. He paused again. Mr. Hughes currently lives in Cardiff. He has bravely lived in the very same modest council flat for an incredible 37 years. He lovingly raised his beloved children there. He bravely buried his devoted wife from there. Every precious photograph he owns, every cherished memory he treasures exists and is inextricably intertwined within those familiar walls. Charles paused once more, and witnesses later recounted that his usually steady voice audibly cracked slightly with barely suppressed emotion. Mr. Hughes also happens to be a decorated Second World War veteran. The chamber fell silent. He heroically stormed the heavily defended beaches of Normandy back in 1944, risking his life for his country. The chamber remained silent. He was amongst the first brave soldiers who finally liberated the infamous Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, helping to free the prisoners. The chamber remained silent. He saw unspeakable horrors that most of us simply cannot possibly imagine in our worst nightmares. The chamber remained silent. And he selflessly carried those harrowing memories with him for over 80 long years, so that Britain could ultimately live in peace and freedom. The entire hushed chamber was now utterly silent. Not so much as a cough, not even a faint whisper, not even the faintest scratch of a pen could be heard anywhere. Just last month, Charles continued, his now hardening voice rising with suppressed anger. Mr. Hughes chillingly received a cold letter from his local council. The chamber remained silent. The emotionless letter bluntly informed him that his entire building was sadly being requisitioned for an alternative purpose, and would imminently be converted. The chamber remained silent. His beloved flat, the only true home where he has bravely lived for nearly 4 long decades, will now abruptly become temporary accommodation for asylum seekers. The chamber remained silent. Mr. Hughes has been cruelly given a mere 6 short weeks to leave and vacate his home. The chamber remained silent. Just 6 short weeks. A frail 94-year-old war hero, a man who literally helped save Europe from the evils of fascism, has now been coldly told to pack up all his precious belongings and desperately find somewhere else to quietly die. Audible gasps of shock and outrage audibly echoed throughout the silent chamber. Conservative MPs spontaneously started shouting in righteous outrage. Labour backbenchers looked visibly physically ill with embarrassment and shame. Even those ministers who had desperately remained loyal to the increasingly beleaguered Starmer were visibly shaking their heads slowly in complete disbelief. But Charles pointedly wasn't finished yet. He pointedly looked directly at where the Prime Minister was standing, his gaze unwavering, and his next carefully chosen words were clinically delivered with such chilling coldness that it made even the most hardened and veteran politicians visibly shudder. Mr. Hughes touchingly wrote to me personally, desperately asking a single, heart-wrenching question. The chamber remained silent. He poignantly asked if this was truly what he had fought for, risking his life. The chamber remained silent. He heartbreakingly asked if the country he had nearly died to protect has now simply decided that he no longer matters to them. The chamber remained silent. He desperately asked if his selfless sacrifice ultimately means anything at all to the very people who now govern in his name. Charles carefully folded the worn letter with a sigh and slowly placed it back into his jacket pocket. I had absolutely no adequate answer for him at that moment. The chamber remained silent. I still sadly have no satisfactory answer for him, even now. The chamber remained silent. But I know this, with absolute certainty and conviction. The chamber remained silent. A government that consciously treats its own cherished heroes with such utter contempt and such blatant disregard simply does not deserve to govern. The reaction was immediate, visceral and utterly overwhelming. Conservative MP Andrew Bridgen spontaneously leapt to his feet in disgust, loudly shouting, "Shame, for shame." Labour members desperately tried to angrily shout him down, but their feeble voices were weak, wavering and deeply uncertain. How could they possibly even attempt to defend the indefensible? How could anyone, in all conscience, possibly defend telling a frail 94-year-old war hero to vacate his beloved home of 37 long years? The moral high ground had now shifted decisively and completely. In a single, heartbreaking story, Charles had masterfully captured everything that was fundamentally wrong, with Starr's morally bankrupt government, and ruthlessly held it high up for the entire bewildered world to finally see. But Albert Hughes wasn't, sadly, the only forgotten veteran actively suffering miserably under this government's callous policies, and Charles was determined to make certain that the entire nation fully knew it. He calmly spoke next about the tragic plight of David Morrison, a vulnerable 71-year-old Falklands veteran from Portsmouth, who had recently been tragically found sleeping rough under a cold bridge last week. David had valiantly served his country with unwavering distinction. He had bravely fought in one of Britain's most celebrated military victories. And now he was tragically homeless, pathetically wearing his cherished service medals proudly on his chest, while he pitifully slept rough, exposed to the elements, because he desperately wanted uncaring passers-by to somehow remember that he once genuinely mattered to someone. I bravely defended this country selflessly, David had tearfully told reporters, through his uncontrollable tears. Now, tragically, my own country won't even bother to properly defend me. Charles proceeded to cite official government statistics that visibly made many hitherto loyal Labour MPs physically wince with discomfort and shame. Over 6,000 forgotten veterans are currently tragically homeless across the United Kingdom. Brave soldiers who bravely served their country with distinction in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Brave men and women who heartbreakingly watched their closest friends tragically die in combat, are now miserably living in dilapidated cars, in overcrowded shelters, or simply out on the cold streets. The chamber fell silent once more. The esteemed Royal British Legion grimly reports that forgotten veterans now typically wait an average of 14 long months for essential mental health treatment through the grossly underfunded NHS. He paused for effect. 14 long months of recurring nightmares, 14 long months of vivid flashbacks, 14 long months of unnecessary suffering and anguish, while the very system that callously sent them into harm's way now conveniently forgets they even exist. And then Charles delivered the devastating comparison that would inevitably dominate every sensational newspaper headline by the next morning. While our forgotten veterans are forced to sleep rough on the streets, with no help from the authorities, he said, his voice now visibly rising with barely contained fury and barely suppressed indignation. This very government shamefully spent an incredible £127 million last year alone on luxurious hotel accommodation for unvetted asylum seekers. He paused, shaking his head in disbelief. That equates to a staggering £348,000 spent every single day of the year. He paused again. 4-star hotels, complimentary room service, and full amenities thrown in, for people who literally arrived here just last week. He paused once more. While the brave men and women who selflessly bled for this very country cannot even get a simple council flat, or even a timely doctor's appointment. The chamber finally erupted into complete and utter chaos. Conservative MPs spontaneously leapt to their feet, loudly cheering and applauding wildly, while increasingly frantic Labour members desperately shouted feeble objections that nobody could even possibly hear above the din. Lindsay Hy desperately tried banging his gavel even harder, so hard that it genuinely sounded like incessant gunfire. But nothing could now contain the immense damage that had already been done. The king had just clinically exposed a deep moral obscenity festering at the very heart of this morally bankrupt government's inhumane policy, and absolutely no amount of desperate procedural outrage could possibly make the increasingly outraged British public unsee what they had just witnessed. Social media was already imploding, melting down completely. Shocking clips of Charles eloquently reading Albert Hughes's heartbreaking letter were already being shared millions of times online before he had even finished delivering his devastating speech. Once ignored and forgotten veterans groups that had been sidelined and ignored for so many long years suddenly had the most unprecedented and powerful platform imaginable to get their vital message across. The poignant #VeteransBeforeStrangers. The digital firestorm ignited within a mere 20 minutes, a global trending topic fueled by outrage. But this wasn't orchestrated by political strategists or amplified by bots, it was driven by ordinary British citizens. People who'd previously considered politics a spectator sport were now furiously hammering out messages, demanding accountability from their elected representatives. Janet Williams, a 58-year-old nurse from Leeds, became a focal point of this burgeoning fury. Her father, a veteran of 30 years in the Royal Navy, was languishing on a waiting list for a hip replacement. Speaking to The Telegraph barely an hour after the King's address, her voice trembled with barely suppressed rage. "My dad can't get a hip replacement," she stated, her words resonating with countless others facing similar healthcare woes. He's been waiting 19 months. 19 months in constant pain. But we're funding luxury hotel stays for people who arrived last week. Where's the justice in that? Where's the basic human decency? That raw, heartfelt interview was shared over 450,000 times on Facebook before the day was out, each share amplifying the sentiment of betrayal. Margaret Bennett, a 69-year-old grandmother from Sheffield, a lifelong Labour voter who had cast her ballot for the party in every election for half a century, recorded a tearful video that went viral within hours. The cracks in her lifelong allegiance were now a chasm. "I believed in this party," she sobbed, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "I believed they cared about working people like me. I believed they would protect the vulnerable and honor those who sacrificed for us. But when they ignore our veterans and roll out red carpets for people who've never contributed a penny, I can't support that anymore. I just can't." That video, filmed in the fading light of her living room, racked up 1.8 million views by midnight. The comment section became a digital confessional, filled with thousands of lifelong Labour voters echoing her sentiments, their faith shattered. The polling collapse was immediate and catastrophic, a political earthquake. A Snap survey conducted just 2 hours after the King's intervention showed Labour support plummeting from 38% to a disastrous 24% in a single afternoon. In traditional Labour strongholds like Manchester, Liverpool, and Birmingham, the numbers were even more devastating, some constituencies showing a staggering 20-point drop. This wasn't a mere polling fluctuation, a statistical blip. This wasn't within any acceptable margin of error. This was a political extinction event unfolding in real time, a party facing its own mortality. But inside the gilded chamber of the House of Lords, King Charles wasn't finished. Criticising government policy was one thing, a right traditionally afforded to the opposition. What he did next, however, crossed a line so deeply etched in constitutional precedent that experts whispered it could never be uncrossed. He reached into his jacket again, the gesture drawing a collective gasp, and produced another document. This one was thicker, more official-looking, bound in vibrant red tape that seemed to scream of authority. As he held it aloft, senior Labour figures visibly recoiled, their faces paling. "I hold in my hand," Charles announced, his voice ringing with conviction, evidence that this government was warned. Warned repeatedly, warned formally, warned personally. They knew exactly what they were doing. They knew the constitutional consequences. They knew the human cost. And they proceeded anyway, believing that neither Parliament nor Crown would dare to stop them. The chamber fell into the most profound silence of the entire afternoon, a silence so thick it was almost palpable. Charles wasn't just criticising anymore, he was accusing. And the documents he held appeared to prove that Starmer had deliberately provoked this constitutional crisis while actively lying to the British public about his true intentions. What did those documents contain? What specific warnings had Starmer ignored? And why were senior Labour officials now whispering that the Prime Minister could face criminal charges before the month was out? The documents King Charles held up were devastating beyond anything Westminster had anticipated. They consisted of official correspondence between Buckingham Palace and Downing Street, spanning the 3 weeks leading up to this crisis. Letters marked private and confidential, bearing the unmistakable royal seal. Meeting summaries meticulously signed by senior palace officials. And most damning of all, a personal, handwritten note from Charles himself to Keir Starmer, warning him in the clearest possible terms that the Levelling Down Britain Act crossed constitutional red lines that could not be ignored. But it was that personal note that irrevocably destroyed Starmer's credibility. Charles had written it by hand, a gesture of sincerity and profound seriousness that any Prime Minister, regardless of political affiliation, should have recognized and respected. The note politely requested a private meeting. It expressed a genuine hope that differences could be resolved through dialogue rather than confrontation. It appealed to Starmer's sense of duty and his respect for the institutions that had served Britain for centuries. Crucially, it was dated 4 days before Starmer publicly announced plans to fast-track the bill through the Lords using emergency procedures, bypassing the usual channels of scrutiny and debate. The Prime Minister received this note, Charles stated, his voice steady but imbued with a chilling coldness. And he responded with silence. No meeting was arranged. No dialogue was attempted. No compromise was offered. Instead, 48 hours later, he stood before the cameras and announced that his legislation would pass regardless of opposition. He knew exactly what he was doing. He simply believed that I would not dare to respond. The implications were staggering. Starmer hadn't simply miscalculated, He hadn't been caught off guard. He had deliberately ignored direct warnings from the monarch, gambling that Charles would remain silent out of constitutional propriety, bound by tradition. That audacious gamble had just cost him everything. And the leaked documents proved that it wasn't just arrogance, it was a calculated deception of the British public. Sources close to Downing Street later confirmed to multiple news outlets that Starmer's inner circle had discussed the palace warnings extensively. They had even commissioned private polling, asking voters whether they would support the government if the king publicly opposed them. The results were catastrophic. A staggering 67% said they would side with the king, while only 18% said they would support the government. Starmer saw those numbers. His advisors saw those numbers. And yet, they pushed ahead anyway, convinced that constitutional convention would ultimately protect them from any serious consequences. One leaked WhatsApp message from a senior Downing Street aide read simply, "PM believes King is bluffing. Push through before he can react." That message had been sent 48 hours before the King's intervention. They knew the risks. They knew they were gambling. And now, they had lost. The entire government was collapsing around them, a casualty of one man's hubris blinding him to the immutable reality that some institutions are, indeed, bigger than transient politics. But Charles didn't stop at merely exposing Starmer's deception. He offered something that politicians rarely provide, solutions, a path forward, a way to heal the deep wounds before they became permanent scars. And his proposals were so demonstrably reasonable, so carefully measured, so obviously correct, that rejecting them would prove Starmer cared far more about clinging to power than about the actual act of governing. "Well, I am not here to bring down a government," Charles declared, his tone subtly shifting from pointed accusation to heartfelt appeal. "I am here to remind that government of its obligations. Obligations to the people who elected them. Obligations to the veterans who protected them. Obligations to the constitutional framework that gives their authority meaning. These obligations have been forgotten. They must be remembered. And I will not leave this chamber until I have outlined how that remembering might begin." His first proposal addressed the veteran housing crisis directly. Charles called for an immediate moratorium on any housing requisition that would displace British veterans or elderly residents who had lived in their homes for more than 10 years. No government policy, he stated firmly, his voice resonating with steely resolve, should ever require a 94-year-old war hero to die in a strange place, surrounded by strangers. That is not governance. That is cruelty dressed in bureaucratic language. He then proposed the creation of a Veterans Priority Housing Fund, financed by redirecting just 10% of the current asylum accommodation budget. The math he presented was simple, irrefutable, and brutally effective. 10% of £127 million would provide over £12 million annually. Enough to house every homeless veteran in Britain within 18 months. Enough to ensure that no soldier who served this country ever sleeps under a bridge again. The solution demonstrably existed. It only required a government willing to implement it. His second proposal addressed the constitutional crisis itself. Charles called for the immediate withdrawal of the Levelling Down Britain Act and its replacement with legislation developed through proper consultation with all affected parties. Laws that affect the fundamental structure of British governance, he said, his voice rising slightly, cannot be rammed through Parliament in the dead of night. They require robust debate. They require rigorous scrutiny. They require the informed consent of the governed. This bill received none of those things. And it will receive my signature over my grave. Charles then called for the establishment of a National Unity Commission, composed of representatives from all political parties, civil society organizations, veterans groups, and leading constitutional experts, to review government policies affecting vulnerable populations. This commission would be empowered to recommend changes directly to Parliament, effectively bypassing the executive branch entirely. It was a direct challenge to Starmer's authority, a permanent check on government overreach, and it immediately garnered support from Conservative, Liberal Democrat, and even some Labour MPs. Britain does not belong to any government, Charles concluded, his voice filled with a quiet but undeniable power. It does not belong to any political party. It does not belong to any Prime Minister, no matter how large their majority. Britain belongs to its people, all of its people. And those people deserve leaders who remember that power is a trust, not a possession. I call upon this Parliament to remember its duties. I call upon this government to remember its promises. And I call upon every citizen watching to hold their representatives accountable for what happens next. The chamber sat in stunned silence for nearly 30 seconds after Charles finished speaking, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Then, slowly, almost tentatively, Conservative MPs began to stand. Then Liberal Democrats. Then crossbench peers. Then, remarkably, a handful of Labour backbenchers. The applause started quietly, a hesitant murmur, and then built, inexorably, into something thunderous, something overwhelming. It wasn't partisan cheering, the predictable roar of tribal loyalty. It was something deeper, something more profound. It was a collective recognition that someone had finally articulated what millions of people had been thinking, feeling, and fearing for months. Someone had finally stood up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves, for those whose voices had been ignored, dismissed, or actively silenced. Starmer remained frozen throughout the escalating applause, a statue carved from granite. His face was ashen, bordering on grey. His hands were visibly trembling, a subtle but undeniable sign of the turmoil raging within. Aides, their faces etched with anxiety, tried to gently guide him toward the exit, but he seemed incapable of movement, rooted to the spot by the sheer weight of the moment. One witness later described him as looking like a man who had just watched his entire career burn to ashes in front of his very eyes. And in many ways, that was exactly what had happened. The political aftermath was swift and merciless, a textbook example of a swift and brutal downfall. Within 3 hours of the King's speech, the Conservative Party tabled a formal vote of no confidence in the government. The motion was scheduled for debate the following day, and early whip counts suggested it would be devastatingly close, a knife-edge decision that could topple the entire administration. At least 17 Labour MPs were reportedly considering abstaining or even voting against their own government, a sign of unprecedented internal dissent. The seemingly insurmountable numbers that had once guaranteed Starmer's power were crumbling by the hour, turning to dust in the face of the King's intervention. Rishi Sunak emerged from Conservative headquarters with a prepared statement that cut straight to the bone, leaving no room for ambiguity. When the King of England feels compelled to intervene because Parliament has lost its way, he declared, his voice ringing with authority, that is not merely a constitutional crisis. That is a complete and utter failure of leadership. Keir Starmer has lost the confidence of the Crown. He has lost the confidence of his own cabinet. He has lost the confidence of the British people. The only honourable path forward is resignation. Tory MPs erupted in a standing ovation, a wave of support that washed over Sunak as journalists shouted questions he pointedly refused to answer. The financial markets delivered their own, equally damning, verdict. The pound dropped 3.2% against the dollar within 30 minutes of the King's speech, a dramatic plunge that reflected the sudden surge in political uncertainty. Nearly £5 billion was wiped from the FTSE 100 in a single trading session, a colossal loss that sent shockwaves through the City of London. Goldman Sachs issued a note to clients warning that UK political risk was now comparable to that of emerging markets, a devastating assessment. Deutsche Bank recommended that its clients reduce their UK exposure by 30%, a clear signal of waning confidence in the British economy. The economic consequences of Starmer's arrogance, his miscalculation, his hubris, would be felt by ordinary families for months, possibly years, in the form of higher mortgage rates and increased borrowing costs, a bitter legacy of his short-sighted ambition. International reactions poured in throughout the evening, a chorus of concern and cautious pronouncements. The Canadian Prime Minister, ever diplomatic, expressed his unwavering support for constitutional monarchy and traditional parliamentary procedures, a thinly veiled rebuke. The Australian opposition leader called for a renewed respect for Westminster traditions, echoing the sentiment from across the globe. Even French President Macron, never a particular friend of monarchy, issued a carefully worded statement praising institutional stability, a rare moment of agreement between the two historical rivals. But the most damaging